Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This is day 34 and we are going to look at the book of Daniel. Now, I don't know what you think about when you think about Daniel. Well, actually, I can guess, and I'd quite like to lay some money that you think about the lion's den and you might think about the fiery furnace, and you're probably less likely to think about the second half of the book of Daniel, which is full of mysterious and difficult things. I'm not going to go into all of that in detail because we haven't got time, but I'm going to talk in some detail about Daniel 7, which is the heart of it, one of the most important chapters in the Old Testament, I think, yeah, we'll probably focus mainly on that today. So the book of Daniel straddles, in terms of the time period it's talking about, the Babylonian and the Persian empires. So after Babylon, you may remember we talked about this a little bit before. After Babylon, Babylon isn't a superpower for all that long in terms of kind of the global sweep of world history. And after Babylon come the Persians. And of course it was Cyrus the Persian who allows the people to return from exile. So the character Daniel straddles that period. He comes to ascendancy in the court of the king of Babylon, and then manages to transition safely and successfully into the court of the kings of Persia. So the book of Daniel contains 6 stories, 6 narratives. These are the ones that we tell our children and that we probably remember ourselves quite well, told in third person form about Daniel and his friends, particularly the 3 friends called Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. And then it contains 4 visions, which are primarily described in first person terms. In other words, I, Daniel, saw this vision. Now, unlike most of the rest of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, it is written in both Hebrew and in Aramaic, and quite a large chunk of it actually is written in Aramaic. Aramaic it's a Semitic language, so it has many points of similarity to Hebrew. It's the language that they would have spoken in Babylon, and the language that the people of Israel come back out of exile speaking. So they go into exile speaking Hebrew, come back out speaking Aramaic. And this is why Jesus and the Jews of his day spoke Aramaic, because this became their mother tongue in exile. And Daniel is written partly in Aramaic. If I give you a brief overview to the book, the first chapter, to a certain extent, is introductory. It's the chapter, if you remember, of Daniel and the vegetables. Daniel is identified as a promising young man. He's brought to the court of the king of Persia, king of Babylon, I beg your pardon. And he's, as part of he's educated quite intensively, but he's also treated with great respect and honour, and they want to kind of bless him, I suppose. They want to feed him the king's food, and so they feed him all this rich stuff. But actually it's stuff that has kind of implications in terms of how it's been prepared, and confusion with idolatry and whether the meat has been prepared according to, which it hasn't, been prepared according to the Jewish law. And so it's easier for Daniel to go vegetarian. It's not a comment on vegetarianism as such, but a comment on his determination to obey the Jewish food laws. And so he refuses the meat, eats the vegetables, and consequently, because he's not eating all this rich stuff, he's much healthier than the other young men at the end of a test period. That's the introductory one, and it's a chapter, and it's a good reflection, or a good opportunity for us to read it and reflect on what it means to live faithfully in a society that doesn't share the values that we are called to live up to. So it's a good chapter. I like the first chapter of Daniel. And then in chapter 2 we get Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, his first dream, and he dreams about a statue with feet of clay, and this is where we get the familiar English expression. It's made of various constituent parts of kind of precious metals and so on, but it has feet of clay and a stone that destroys it. And Daniel interprets this dream to the king. It's about 4 great kingdoms. But the key ideas in chapter 2 are probably held within Daniel's prayer when God reveals the dream to him. Beginning at verse 20, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things." And so it continues. The God who is the revealer of mysteries is very much a theme in this part of the book. And also this theme of the God who sets up kings and removes kings. A verse that I come back to again and again when I find myself praying for the world and the rulers of the world right now, as always. And then Nebuchadnezzar's kind of statement of faith that he makes at the end of that chapter. And when Daniel has interpreted the dream to him, and he says this, verse 47, "Truly your God is God of God and Lord of kings and revealer of mysteries." Wonderful, wonderful verse. I love that. And there's a song actually that I won't sing to you, but that picks up that verse. And it's going around in my head right now. Chapter 3 is Nebuchadnezzar doesn't learn. He doesn't learn from Daniel in terms of worshipping the true God. So he sets up this great golden image of himself, demands that everybody bow down to worship it. And Daniel's 3 friends who've been promoted along with him, called Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, they refuse to bow down to this fiery furnace, and as a result, to this golden statue. And as a result, they're thrown into this fiery furnace. But they make, and this is one of my favourite verses in all of Scripture, they make this extraordinary declaration of faith, which is in verse 17 and 18 here. So the king threatens them. He says, "If you don't bow down, I'm going to throw you into this fiery furnace." And they say this, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." Whoa, that's just extraordinary. We're not answerable to you, O king. We're answerable to a higher authority than you. Love that. But then they go on. "If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." Great statement of faith. But then it goes on and it's even greater. "But if not," in other words, if he does not save us, "be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." This statement of God is able to deliver us, but even if he does not, we still will not compromise. And that I find really moving, and it just inspires my own, it challenges me about my own faith and my determination to obey God whether or not he blesses me. It reminds me of the book of Job, actually. So I love that. We'll move on. Nebuchadnezzar has another dream, a dream of a great tree, which Daniel describes as Nebuchadnezzar himself, this great tree that kind of extends out and gives shade to the whole earth and blesses it. It describes Nebuchadnezzar's great kingdom. But this great tree is cut down, and Daniel says, well, this means you're going to go mad. And then Nebuchadnezzar does go mad for a season, and it's a disturbing story until he repents, until he remembers the true God, and then he's restored to his kingdom. Now, at the end of chapter 4, we have an important little phrase that is important because it's going to be relevant to the kind of theme word of chapter 7, which is the core of the book. So chapter 4, verse 34, the Most High God, who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. One of the kind of key questions of Daniel is, who is the true king? And this language of dominion is very important for reasons that I'm going to show you in just a moment. Chapter 5 is, I think, a very funny story, and I'll tell you why it's funny in a moment. So now we have King Belshazzar, Now, Belshazzar, for a long time, there was no evidence that this king really existed. And the skeptical scholars said, oh, this just proves this is just fiction. And then they found a little clay cylinder, and guess where it's stored? In the British Museum. You can see it there. A little clay cylinder that described King Belshazzar, or Belshazzar. I didn't describe him as king, but it describes Belshazzar. And Belshazzar basically was the son of the king, Nabonidus. And King Nabonidus looks like he was kind of sent into voluntary exile, really. He was a devout worshipper of the moon god. And this was very threatening to the kind of religious establishment because they worship of Marduk, and the worship of the god is always kind of political as well. So the fact that he wants to kind of divert worship to the moon god is politically threatening. And so he kind of takes himself off and happily gets on with worshipping the moon god in relative obscurity. And his son, Belshazzar, rules as his regent. So Belshazzar is a historical figure, and the book of Daniel was, in modern times, the book of Daniel was the first one to show us that figure, although we now have extra biblical verification of his existence. So Belshazzar is throwing this great feast. And it's very magnificent, very opulent, very hedonistic. And as part of his feast, he suddenly, in his drunkenness, says, "Oh, I tell you what we'll do. We'll get the golden vessels from the temple of in Jerusalem, and we'll eat off those." So he sends for these vessels, and then he praises his own gods as he's eating from these holy vessels. And then the fingers of this hand appear and write on the wall, and it writes these words that he can't understand, and he's terrified. And it takes the Queen Mother to say to him, well, there's this bloke in your kingdom who might be able to interpret this for you. So he sends for Daniel, and Daniel then, through the power of God, interprets the dream to him. Now, the deal is this. Belshazzar is so scared, he says, if anyone can explain this to me, I'll make him the first in the kingdom. I'll give him my royal signet ring, and I'm going to I'll promote him greatly. So in comes Daniel. And Daniel says, well, what it means is, your kingdom's coming to an end. The Persians are right at the door, and this very day your kingdom is going to be taken from you. And this is where it's really funny, because Belshazzar then says, oh, thanks so much for interpreting it. I'm going to make you prime minister. I'm going to promote you in my kingdom. And the reader is left thinking, Belshazzar, didn't you listen? There is going to be no kingdom. And you might want to think about other things than promoting Daniel, because right now you've been told the Persians are at the door. So I do think this is a kind of reader in human folly, really. Anyway, that's that story. Then we get the Daniel and the Lion's Den, chapter 6. I'm going to focus now on the second half of the book, but particularly chapter 7. Now, this book is written in, the second half of this book, from 7 onwards, is written in what is known as the apocalyptic genre. Now, I mentioned this a little bit when we were talking about Ezekiel, but I want to talk a little bit more about what apocalyptic writing means, and then we'll look at chapter 7. Now, we have no modern style of writing that is very much like apocalyptic writing, and that makes it immediately very difficult for us to understand. The closest analogy I can think of is certain parts of science fiction. Now, to my mind, science fiction falls into two types. This is probably oversimplifying it, but there are kind of the types that are very interested in the technology and so on. But there are the types of science fiction that are much less interested in technology than in kind of thought experiments about how humans might operate in a new world, in new paradigms, when there are aliens or when there are particular technological things that allow humans to do different things. But the prime purpose of this type of science fiction is not to explore the technology, but to explore what it is to be human or whatever. So it's a kind of truth-seeking device, really. And I think apocalyptic is a little bit like that type of science fiction. Apocalypse itself simply means revelation or unveiling. So it is asking the question of what is the true reality beyond what the reality that we can see with our eyes. So apocalypses are really, they are uncovering the spiritual realities that are at work, the spiritual forces that are at work behind the kings and the politics of the day. It's a style of writing that largely emerged in a time of persecution. So there are lots of apocalypses written. Daniel is one. We get some in Ezekiel. Most of the apocalypses are written between the Testaments, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and there's a whole flurry of them. And that's because in this period, the Greek Empire is governing Israel, and is a very, very cruel empire. And it outlaws observance of the Jewish religion, and it cruelly persecutes those who disobey that. And in this time of persecution, this apocalyptic genre flourishes, and people use the apocalypses as a device for saying, what might God be doing? What is going on? And how can faithful people of God hold on in these times of great persecution? The most well-known apocalypse of all, of course, is the book of Revelation, and we will talk about that in however many weeks' time when we get there. How do we interpret apocalypses? Here's a few general pointers. Apocalypses are full of what to us are utterly bizarre images, and we should never make the mistake of taking these images literally. They are kind of coded to some extent, and the code would have been partly understood by the people of the day. And some of these we can kind of decode, and others we struggle to decode because we don't know enough about the world in which it was written and for which it was intended. So I'll give you a quick example from Revelation itself, which is that it speaks about Babylon. Again and again it speaks about Babylon. Now Babylon doesn't exist as a force, as a political force in the time that Revelation was written, and it is very clearly understood to be a code for Rome. So it's much safer to say, that Babylon's going to have its downfall, and evil, wicked Babylon, and all the kind of readers for whom it's intended understand that this is thinly veiled language for critique of Rome itself. So that sort of idea. So there are images that are being used which would have been fairly readily understood, we think, by the original readers, and which it's much harder for us to understand. I'll give you an example, a modern example. If I showed you a picture of a bear with kind of blood dripping from its jaws, and it had a saddle on its back, and on the saddle was a picture of a hammer and a sickle, I think you would instantly decode that as an image of the Soviet Union, because the hammer and the sickle, and because the bear is a symbol of Russia, and the blood dripping from the jaws would be us saying something about how we perceive the Soviet Union. I showed you a picture of a certain type of dragon, a red dragon, perhaps on a woman's cheek or a man's cheek, and they're wearing a rugby shirt, then you'd say, oh, well, this is clearly a supporter of the Welsh rugby team. And we've interpreted that symbol to mean something. So these symbols have meanings, but they are sometimes clear to us than others. We need help with these symbols, because you and I, living in the 21st century, unless we have studied carefully, we are not going to instantly recognise these symbols. And we should be careful about over-interpreting the details. So what happens in an apocalypse is a person is kind of taken into this realm of heavenly things, and is given a bit of a tour by an angel. And the angel kind of stands them there and says, look at this. And then the person kind of sees this stuff going on. And quite often the angel says, do you understand that? And the person says, no, I don't. And the angel says, let me explain that to you. And we get that a lot. We saw it in Ezekiel, we see it in Daniel, and then you see it in Revelation. And it's also a feature of the apocalypses that aren't in the Bible as well. Now, having made those general comments, I want to talk a bit about chapter 7 in the last few minutes. So chapter 7 shows us 4 beasts emerging from the sea, and this is going to become an established image for the emergence of a world leader. And so these 4 beasts that emerge from the sea, one at a time, represent once again 4 kingdoms. We had 4 kingdoms in Nebuchadnezzar's first dream in chapter, was it 2 or 3? And we're going to see again this idea of 4 kingdoms, one after another. Probably it refers to Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, which were 2 kingdoms but are often lumped together in Daniel, the Greeks and the Romans. Probably it's those 4. Some people think it might be Babylon, the Medes, the Persians separately, and the Greeks. But I think there's probably better evidence to suggest that the Medes and the Persians are lumped together, and the 4th one is Rome. Now, these creatures that emerge from the sea, which representing these world leaders, or these empires, if you like, are abominable hybrid creatures. They kind of got features of one animal and features of another animal. And we know from reading Leviticus that in Jewish law, any animal that kind of crosses over a boundary, so if it chews the cud but it doesn't have a cleft hoof sort of thing, it ought to have both, because that's what a clean animal has. And if it kind of doesn't have those 2 things, then it's unclean. And so these hybrid animals are by definition unclean, and they're somehow more than unclean. They're kind of abominable because they are neither one thing nor the other. Okay, but what is that's significant about these animals is that they are arrogating to themselves the authority that belongs to humanity. So the first animal is lifted off the ground and stands on its 2 feet like a man. This is verse 4 of chapter 7, and is given the mind of a man. So it's really a beast, but it's kind of pretending to be human, trying to be human. Don't overinterpret it literally, though. The third one, very clear. It's oh yes, this language of dominion. Another one, this is verse 6, like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird, and dominion is given to it. So these creatures are seeking or gaining dominion. Now, dominion, I've already flagged it up, is a very, very important word. And it goes right back to, quick pause if you think for yourself where it might go back to. If you've been watching these videos, you might remember Genesis 1. Genesis 1, this statement of the human vocation, this job description, if you like, for the true human, is to have dominion. Genesis 1:28, dominion over the earth. And this is this job description for what it means to be human, which is given to Adam. Adam fails to keep it. Given to Israel. Israel fails to keep it fully. Will be given to Jesus, who keeps it fully. But this is this kind of recurring pattern, and here we have it again. And these creatures are claiming dominion, but have no true claim to dominion. They are usurpers, if you like. And then there's this sudden break in the narrative, and it's like this kind of this turmoil of the blasphemous words and the monstrosities being conducted by those creatures kind of suddenly drops. It goes quiet, and then verse 9, as I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days, Daniel's word for God, took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. And then, verse 13, behold, with the clouds of heaven, theophany, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days. Now, who is this Son of Man? So, Son of Man, in a simple sense, Son of Man simply means a human, a person. So Daniel has this vision, and God takes his seat, his throne, and then a person is brought before him. But this person approaches with the theophany, with the clouds of heaven, sort of accompanying him, if you like. Now, what happens to this person? He is given dominion. So here is our true human. Here is our true human who is doing what humans are supposed to do. And he is given the dominion that the beasts had tried to usurp. To him was given dominion and glory in a kingdom, and all peoples, nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So let me just try and join these things up a little bit. This language of Son of Man is Ben Adam. So we've got Adam ideas kind of resonating. The dominion language definitely makes those Adam ideas resonate. Speaking as a Christian now, I have to connect this with Jesus Christ, because Jesus himself uses this language of Son of Man. Whenever Jesus talks about Son of Man, he is picking up on this passage, and it would have been kind of resonating in the mind of the listener. So Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. In fact, he quotes this actual verse in Mark 14 verse 62. At his trial, Caiaphas, the high priest, asks him if he is the Messiah, and Jesus replies, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power. So Son of Man, reference to Daniel 7, right hand of power, reference to Psalm 110, which is a psalm that the early church picked up and very much understood to refer to Jesus, and here Jesus does it himself. So I am, and you will see the Son of Man, Daniel 7, sitting at the right hand of power, Psalm 110, and coming with the clouds of heaven, Daniel 7 again. So here Jesus is very much viewing this as being a prophecy that refers to him, probably to his ascension after his death and resurrection. One more thing to link up with this, and this is Psalm 8. Now, I mentioned in passing a little while ago that sometimes the sort of gender-neutral language that our modern Bibles often use can be unhelpful, and this is an example of this. So in Psalm 8, very well-known, very beautiful psalm, which says, among other things, verse 3, when I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Now, in the first instance, the psalmist is probably just referring to himself as a human. What is little old me that you, and when you've made this wonderful world, that you would bother with little old me? Okay, but it takes a deeper significance, because he goes on to say, yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him with glory and honour. You have given him, here's that word again, dominion over the works of your hands. So here we have Son of Man and dominion. In Daniel we have Son of Man and dominion. And then Jesus takes this language from Psalm 8, from Daniel 7, from Psalm 110, which is an enthronement psalm, and uses it about himself. And so here we have something, Daniel is getting a vision of the enthronement, the ascension of the one person the only person who will ever be truly human, who will ever truly fill that human job description. Wonderful chapter, very important chapter for understanding the New Testament. Hope you enjoyed that insight. I will see you tomorrow for Daniel, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea. That's what comes next. I will see you tomorrow for Hosea.